Hey everyone, today Nvidia's competitor to the RX 480 came out today, which is the GTX 1060, and it's a pretty impressive card, but depending on a number of factors, we're going to compare the GTX 1060 to AMD's RX 480 and discuss which one is better and which delivers the best performance for the lowest price. Now bear in mind, I'm mostly an Nvidia fanboy, so this video may actually be surprising. So let's get right into it. So firstly, I'm not here really to deliver any benchmarks or a direct comparison. I'm merely here to talk about the cards and the logical factors surrounding them. So if you want excellent benchmarks, I would suggest that you check out Hardware Unboxed. I'll link him in the description. He does some of the best benchmarks videos and has even written some articles that you can reference to later. He's really an awesome guy, deserves way more subs than he has right now. But I'm just going to outline the number of factors and what you should purchase and the advantages and disadvantages of each card in comparison. And I'll be using Hardware Unboxed benchmarks because those are just the best benchmarks in my opinion. And I'm going to be using both the Founders Edition of the GTX 1060 and the reference 4GB and 8GB RX 480 models. So on the front of price, the RX 480 is $200 and is the cheapest of these graphics cards. The 8GB RX 480 pumps in at $240 USD, and the GTX 1060 Founders Edition comes in at $299, with the cheaper aftermarket variants coming in at $250 USD for the Gigabyte Windforce model, which you can find on Newegg. In Australia, however, if you're looking at a card, the 4GB RX 480 is the cheapest, netting you $319, and an 8GB costing $379, whereas the cheapest GTX 1060 is an aftermarket Gainwood one, and it's $429. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any Founders Edition prices here in Australia as they weren't listed at the time of the video, but I might update that. So if you want to hit that 60 FPS sweet spot, it will cost you $7.15 per frame with the GTX 1060 aftermarket, whereas the 8GB RX 480 will cost you $6.32 per frame, and lastly the 4GB RX 480 will cost you $5.32 per frame, giving the RX 480 4GB really the best bang for your buck. And considering at most right now you're giving up to 1 to 2 frames in games currently versus the 8GB RX 480, it's not really that bad of a deal. And on top of that, if you're looking at the GTX 1060 and you're really worried about that performance, you're really only losing 13% in most games overall on average, and we'll discuss this a little bit later because it's really not as bad as it seems. So the RX 480 4GB is really your best budget card here, and it's really what you should be investing into, seeing as it can provide you really a great gaming experience at 1080p, and it really doesn't cost that much. Especially here in Australia, where the margin gets wider between the RX 480 and the 1060, if you turn down a setting or two in order to get similar performance to the 1060 wherever it's leading right now, you've still got a really good card. So right now, I'd probably buy an RX 480 just on price alone, and then upgrade later on and buy a flagship card, because you can just save your money and in 2 years time throw away the RX 480, say that you had a great time with it, and then buy whatever's the newest, most hip thing. So on the front of performance, we're going to be using the Founders Edition cards versus the reference RX 480 because we're putting reference cards up against reference cards, and I just think that's the fairest way to do it. I'm not like someone like Jay's 2 cents where you take an EVGA superclock 1060 and put it up against a reference RX 480 with really old drivers. Yeah, I just don't think that that's very fair. And overall, we see a 12% performance increase across numerous titles for the GTX 1060 at both 1080p and 1440p at the same settings over the RX 480. Now, where the RX 480 really shines though is in the newer APIs like DX12 and Vulkan, and based off Hardware Unboxed benchmarks, you can see that in Doom, with Vulkan it's leading as much as 14% over the 1060, and 13% in Hitman DX12. So I suspect DX12, the margin will give the RX 480 either a small lead over the GTX 1060 or it'll match it. And really, you're only going to be giving up maybe 5% at the very least to the 1060. And considering that PC games are moving toward DX12, getting an RX 480 may actually lead you having that better performance or even similar performance to a 1060 in DX12 titles. So essentially that gap is cleared thanks to the hardware technologies like async computing from the AMD cards, and also just overall the bit bus, because the bit bus is actually bigger on the RX 480 compared to the 1060, which only has 192 bits, whereas the RX 480 has 256 bit. Now, since the GTX 1060 doesn't have any SLI fingers or any SLI support, you won't be able to play with two 1060s in any DX11 titles, meaning that you're basically stuck with the performance of one GTX 1060 no matter what. The RX 480, on the other hand, has Crossfire support for DX11, DX12, and Vulkan titles, meaning that if you want to later on put a second 480 in your system, you can, and you just need to make sure that your system can support the extra 150 watts and that the game that you have is supported for the scaling. Now, I will say that in DX12 titles that support explicit multi-adapter, the GTX 1060 can be paired with another GTX 1060 without the need for any SLI fingers or anything. But unfortunately though, you won't be able to play any older DX11 titles, and if your game doesn't support explicit multi-adapter, then you're out of luck. So again, you're better off with an RX 480, as you can crossfire in almost any title as long as it has scaling support. The GTX 1060 does allow for G-Sync support, but considering you need to buy a special monitor for such an experience, and it usually costs a lot more than a FreeSync monitor, again the RX 480 is looking good here on the price front. It supports FreeSync, and I will say however, if you have a G-Sync monitor then it won't really matter. However, Nvidia has created a new VSync technology called FastSync, which blends VSync and G-Sync together really, giving you no tearing like VSync but less latency like G-Sync does. This, however, is unreleased right now, but a beta version is out and it looks promising and seems to be delivering. And the best of all is that you don't really need a special monitor to actually activate this feature as far as I know. Someone might correct me on that though, but it's looking pretty good here, but there is some stuttering in some games, so do be noted on that. But I mean, most gamers don't really put FreeSync on and FastSync anyway, and G-Sync really. But if you do want that experience, it does look like the RX 480 is the better option here on the price front. So for me, the GTX 1060 is a great card, and it delivers on its promise of 980 performance mostly. Unfortunately though, the RX 480 is just something that can't be beat, especially the cheap 4GB model, which delivers very similar performance to the 8GB RX 480 model, and at a much cheaper price. At the end of the day, you can always crossfire if you want to keep your RX 480 experience a little bit longer, or you can upgrade by saving your money on the cheaper RX 480. So for now, just turn down some settings on your 480 and you can reach those small gaps that the 1060 currently has over it. However, in the future, the RX 480 should really pull ahead in its performance, mainly because of its wider bit bus versus the 192 of the GTX 1060, and also the fact that it has async support in the actual hardware, meaning that it can actually perform better in DX12 titles. So all in all, yes, Nvidia did make a very nice card, but it's only really tempting to US buyers, and right now the RX 480 is still cheaper, and spending that extra $10 for the GTX 1060 will give you some performance leads in current DX11 titles. But to me, you're really much better off still buying the RX 480 and having the wider bit bus, async compute support, and crossfire capabilities than spending the extra $10 for the Nvidia GTX 1060. AMD truly have dominated the mid to low end market, with the RX 480, and if the aftermarket cards are anything to go off, the RX 480 may bridge that gap even more in DX11 with the higher stock and boost clocks of the aftermarket RX 480.